for the last 40 years. And today I have my special guest. She's a clinical neuroscientist and a CEO of rapidly scaling neurotherapy clinic and school, none other than Dr. Tiff Thompson.
Hi.
Welcome, Dr. Tiff on Book One Wonder. And can you please introduce more about yourself that I miss?
Sure. Yeah. So I do what's called multimodal neurostimulation, and this I have an online and live school. In fact, we just finished teaching a 3-day course today. So we do a lot of certifications, board certifications, and people that want to learn how to do things like brain mapping and understand brain waves, and then treat different types of conditions with neurostimulation.
Yes, and thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and wisdom to the world. Thank you. Bringing neuroscience to mental health practices. That will be our main topic for today, Dr. Taib. So, the promise of neuroscience is to move from treating diagnostic labels like depression to understanding dysfunctional brain circuits. In practice, how is it the shift changing the initial questions a clinician asks or the way they conceptualize a client distress?
All right, so hang on one second. For some reason, it's hard to hear you. I'm going to take out my earbuds for a second. Could you ask
Yes.
that question one more time?
Okay, yes. The promise of neuroscience is to move from treating a diagnostic labels like depression to understanding a dysfunctional brain circuits. In practice, how is it a shift changing the initial questions of clinician ask or the way they conceptualize the client's distress?
So, the way that disorders have been classified classically are through symptoms, right? It says, well, this individual has this symptom, that symptom. Let's say they're dysphoric, they're anhedonic, which means that they don't get pleasure in anything. They're uh, hypersomnia, meaning they sleep too much, or they're over aroused. So you might say, okay, well, that cluster of symptoms sounds like depression, so we're going to give you this diagnosis of depression. Well, so what the nature of this work does is it actually looks at the profile the individual has to understand why they're experiencing the symptoms they're experiencing, and more than that, it lays out the flavor of the symptom. So your anxiety, for instance, Daniel, should you have any, would be different than your neighbor's anxiety, and they would have different profiles in data. So it's a
Mhm.
far more fine-tuned way of understanding why people are experiencing what they're experiencing, why their behaviors are what they are, and why their symptoms are what they are, by looking at the organ that's producing them.
So, Dr. Tiff, historically, mental health has been split between talk therapy and medication. How does neuroscience act as a unifying bridge between these approaches, helping explain why, for instance, SSRS or CBT can both impact the same fear circuitry?
Well, so I mean, when we're talking about medication, for instance, you just mentioned an SSRI, so that's a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. It's working at the issue from a chemical perspective, right? So what an SSRI does, and that's one of many antidepressants, is it will block the reuptake, meaning it will block the the quick reabsorption of a neurotransmitter called serotonin. And serotonin is a neurotransmitter that you make when you feel good, when you feel at ease, when you feel calm. When you fall in love, for instance, you make a lot of serotonin, right? So if you've ever been in love, then you know what that feeling feels like. So medications are working on the brain at a chemical level, whereas psychotherapy is working with the individual's emotional psychology, right? And really trying to understand, rationalize, process, unravel, unpack why they feel the way they feel, and allowing for them to a get it out, and then b process it. So they're completely different animals. What this modality is, it's different. It's not pharmaceutical. In fact, it's an alternative to pharmaceuticals. What pharmaceuticals do is they suppress symptoms, right? Medication suppresses symptoms. It doesn't address the origin of the symptom. And so your mind and your brain are inextricably linked, right? And what that means is that you have a physiological expression inside your skull that matches the psychological goings on, that matches the way that you feel, it matches the way that you're, behaving, thinking, the weird habits that you might have. And so the nature of this work is it is an alternative to pharmacy. It's an alternative to psychopharmacology, in that we're actually addressing the source of the issue, right? We're going right for the source of the problem by treating the brain.
Dr. Tiff, a major challenge is the gap between lab neuroscience and the messy reality of the therapy room. What are the most clinically actionable neuroscience findings that have successfully made this jump in the last decade
The most successful neuro the most successful findings in neuroscience that have made the jump in the last decade to what?
to the gap between the lab neuroscience?
So, how has neuroscience impacted the therapy room? Is that sort of the question that you're asking?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
There's pop neuroscience, which is awesome. Really, when I say pop neuroscience, what I mean is a lot of the individuals who might be listening, for instance, will know what the amygdala is, right? They'll know
Hmm.
what the cortex is. They'll know what the brainstem is, right? They'll know what dopamine is. They'll know what maybe they'll know what serotonin is, right? And so that popular neuroscience, it's interesting, it's engaging, it's memorable, and people can understand. Oh man, you're having this huge fight or flight reaction, for instance. Wow, your amygdala must be firing, and like I said, that's great. The good news really is that there's layers and layers and layers of granularity where you can go beyond just that. I.e., for instance, the amygdala. There's two of them. They're very small almond-shaped areas in the brain. They are inhibited by by the insular cortex on your left and your right temporals, as well as the anterior cingulate. So what I'm saying here is that there's so much more that's going to go into the processing of fear, and there's other regions of the brain that process threat beyond the amygdala. And so pop neuroscience is exciting because it brings people into the conversation and into the fold, and clinical therapists and psychologists can have conversations with their patients about neuroscience to a degree. The downside of that is that the the generalization of it, sometimes actually misses the mark of what's really going on.
Well, very well said, Dr. Teeve. So, beyond explaining how can neuroscience inform direct intervention, for example, how does understanding the rhythm of the profound cortex or re-engagement after stress change how you time a cognitive reframe or grounding technique?
Okay, so I'm going to repeat the question. I think you're asking about the prefrontal cortex and the rhythms of the prefrontal cortex. And then I think
Yes.
you're asking about stress recovery. Is that correct?
Yes, please.
Okay. I mean, everybody has different profiles, right? And so let's just start by talking about stress. And there are approximately 13 different profiles for stress and anxiety. And that's a minimum. And there's actually some imposter profiles, right? So some of us don't actually recover from stress. Some stress is prefrontal, yes. Some stress, we see it as a prefrontal pattern. In fact, one of the patterns is an anteriorized beta pattern. Now, when we're talking about the cortex, you're talking about the bark of the brain. Cortex means bark in Latin, and that bark generates a frequency called beta. Right, there's 6 layers of pyramidal neurons, right? 6 layers of neurons that make up the bark of the brain, and they generate a very fast rhythm that's 12 to 30 hertz, and it's called beta. And beta is active conscious cognitive processing. It's thinking. So while you're listening to me, Daniel, you're probably making some beta content. Chances are good. So there are, like I said, 13 different profiles of stress. individuals will elevate and de-elevate. They will arouse and then they will, ebb out of a vigilant state naturally. We do that all day long. We have physiological arousal, right? If someone shouted at you out of the blue, you would have a physiological arousal, but your nervous system, chances are, has the ability to adapt and recuperate and is quite resilient. Now, it's the environments, the neurological environments, the individuals who have been exposed to prolonged stress that are the ones that are in the worst case scenario, right? For enduring more stress. Why is that? Because when we are exposed to prolonged stress, we make something called uh, corticosteroids and cortisol, right? And so what these little neurotransmitters do is they actually begin to degrade something called long-term potentiation, and think about that as essentially firings, right? So parts of our brain, the hippocampus, which you might have heard of, right? The hippocampus is a seat of memory and learning. And the seat of memory and learning has within it a tiny little mossy patch called the dentate gyrus. And that area makes new brain cells. In fact, it's one of the two areas of the brain where we have new brain cells coming, which are called progenitor cells. Now, back to stress. If you are exposed to stress for long stretches of time, let's say you were a child and you grew up in a household that was traumatic, right? Your parents fought and you were abused, that kind of thing, then your system never got to bounce back, right? And so prolonged exposure to stress is going to ultimately degrade that beautiful part of your brain that makes new brain cells. And so I'm answering your question by giving you two ways of being. One, the individual who has a naturally resilient nervous system, who can bounce back out of stress easily. And then two, the individual who doesn't, based upon nature, right? Based upon nature and what they were brought up in, probably a little bit of nurture too. And so to kind of put a bow on this, we all develop paths of least resistance, right? We all have ways of being that's natural to us. And in order to in order to break free of whatever psychological patterns we're dealing with, those paths of least resistance have to be altered. They have to be disrupted, and they have to be supplanted with something new, with something different, right? And so that's where this work is really fascinating and interesting and meaningful and profound, is that there are ways to actually, reprogram an individual, and the individual's profile. Let's say you have anxiety profile number 7. That profile is going to want something different than the other anxiety profiles, right? It's going to want a different protocol um, to make its way back to being regulated again. Does that make sense?
Makes sense, Dr. Tiff, and very well said. Many therapeutic modalities like parts work, mindfulness, or EMDR now have proposed neural correlates. Thus, validating a modality with neuroscience change how you practice it, or does it simply provide a richer language for what was already effective?
Does the way that I practice neuroscience provide a new language for what?
Like parts work, mindfulness, or EMDR.
Well, yeah, thanks for clarifying that question. Here's the thing. I mean, that the neuroscience is always at play. What I would say is an individual's availability, susceptibility, responsiveness to certain modalities will be dependent upon the profile that they show. So let me just talk for a moment about EMDR, and I'll talk about the neuroscience of EMDR, which is kind of interesting. It's kind of neuroscience, it's kind of physiology. So here's how it goes. In EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, right? What you are asked to do is to, find your way back to a memory. And usually these memories are traumatic memories, since this is a trauma therapy approach, right? And the individual will watch a pacer, whether it's a finger or a light, goes back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, and they move their way through that traumatic memory. What's happening while the individual is watching that tracer go back and forth is their eyeballs, which are dipoles. A dipole, think of a battery as a dipole. There's a plus and a minus, right? Your eyeballs are dipoles with a plus and a minus. And so as you look left and right and left and right, there's a large electrical sweep that comes across your orbital frontal cortex, right? The orbital frontal is right behind your eyeballs. And so as you look left and right, you are actually on your own stimulating your brain. And if you are recalling a troublesome memory while doing that, you are effectively breaking that memory out of quarantine, right? You're effectively breaking that memory out of quarantine. What that means is it allows for the movement and the processing of content that otherwise has been locked away. So that's one interesting example of how we can see neuroscience in psychotherapeutic modalities. It would take more for me to probably to unpack parts work, CBT, that kind of stuff, but EMDR is a particularly available modality for your question.
Empowering answer, Dr. Tiff. So to wrap up our discussion for today, finally, for a client sitting across from you beyond the science, what is the most hopeful, empowering message that a neuroscience of mental health offers about our capacity to change and heal?
Oh yeah, well we're incredibly plastic. The human being is capable of so much more than we know at this juncture in time, right? There is, as cheesy as it sounds, there's quite a lot of mind over matter that plays in to how much capability and potential we have, right? And so I'm hearing your music, so I trust that it's time to go. But the good news is that, we're completely changeable, plastic, adaptable creatures, and we really have the world in our hands.
Adaptable indeed, adaptability. So, Dr. Tiff, can you please invite our listeners to support your advocacy, your business, or whatever projects that you're doing right now?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, the School of Neurotherapy is the website you're looking at. That's for clinicians. That's for mental health care practitioners. The clinic is neurofieldneurotherapy.com, and that is if anybody would like to know more about their brain and know more about our modality. So neurofieldneurotherapy.com. But you can get there through the school because we are linked up, these companies. So. All right, Daniel. Well, thank you for your time.
You are most welcome. And can you please, before I will let you go, can you please recommend a book or books that influence your journey?
Yeah. There's a book called The Other Brain by Douglas Fields. And he does a beautiful, beautiful job of talking about the glue that holds the brain together. It's called glia. And so it's for neuro nerds. That would be the book that I recommend.
Yes, thank you for the recommended book, Dr. Tiff. And one more before I will let you go. What would you piece of advice for those people out there who want to be like you?
Oh, I would say don't be like me. Be like you. No, be like you. That's the best that you can be.
Yes, be like you, people. So what will be your advice?
Well, that's my advice. Don't try to be like anybody else. Be like you, right? Don't want to be anybody else. Be who you are, because that's the best, Daniel. Like Daniel Lucas, you are the best Daniel Lucas I've ever met. I've never seen anybody do it any better than you. Such a pleasure to meet you. Thanks for having me.
Likewise, Dr. Tiff. More to come, people. See you soon.